Mara Cole stood barefoot on Italian marble, staring at the locked terrace door of her honeymoon suite, and realized with crystal clarity that she had married a man who would never let her go. Outside, the Amalfi Coast shimmered like a postcard promise. Inside, security cameras blinked red in every corner, guards patrolled manicured gardens, and her husband, Lucian Moretti, billionaire, savior, and something far darker, watched her every breath with the patient calm of a predator who had already won. She had 24 hours before he returned from Milan. 24 hours to escape the most beautiful prison she'd ever seen. If you want to know whether Mara breaks free or falls deeper into Lucian's world, stay with me until the end of this story. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the globe. The morning Mara decided to leave her husband, the sun rose over the Mediterranean like molten gold, indifferent to the quiet desperation unfolding in the cliffside villa. She stood at the bedroom window, watching light spill across turquoise water, and tried to remember the exact moment gratitude had curdled into fear. 3 months ago, she'd been a waitress in a Brooklyn diner, drowning in her mother's medical bills and loan sharks who smiled with too many teeth. Then Lucian Moretti had walked into her life, elegant, impossibly wealthy, and offering salvation without conditions, or so she'd thought. Mrs. Moretti. The voice behind her was soft, deferential. Mara turned to find Carlotta, the villa's housekeeper, setting down a breakfast tray with the precision of a museum curator handling priceless artifacts. "Your meal, signora." "Thank you, Carlotta." Mara forced warmth into her voice, though the older woman's eyes held the same watchful distance as everyone else on Lucian's staff. Not unkind, just aware of boundaries, of loyalties that had nothing to do with the woman who wore the wedding ring. Carlotta retreated with a small bow, and Mara was alone again with her thoughts and the untouched breakfast. Poached eggs, fresh figs, espresso in a cup so delicate it seemed like it might shatter if she breathed wrong. Everything perfect, everything controlled. She crossed to the terrace door and tried the handle. Locked. Her pulse kicked up despite expecting exactly that. She'd tested it yesterday and the day before. Every exit in the sprawling villa had the same problem, electronically sealed, requiring either Lucian's fingerprint or a security code she didn't have. The windows were bulletproof glass. The cliffs dropped 200 feet to razor-sharp rocks and churning surf. Paradise as a prison. Luxury as chains. Mara pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched a yacht cut white lines through blue water. Freedom, just out of reach. Story of her life. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, Lucian's name lighting up the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, using those seconds to smooth her voice into something that wouldn't betray the knot of panic in her chest. "Good morning, beautiful." His voice was velvet and smoke, the slight Italian accent he never quite lost, adding texture to perfect English. "Did you sleep well?" "Like the dead," Mara said, immediately regretting the word choice. Lucian had a strange relationship with death, spoke of it too casually, too often, as if it were a business associate he occasionally consulted. "I miss you already." There was rustling on his end, the muted sounds of a hotel room. "Milan," he'd said, "meetings with investors, back by tomorrow evening." "The bed is too empty without you." "Then maybe you shouldn't have left 3 days into our honeymoon." The words came sharper than intended, but Mara was tired of performing, tired of pretending that being abandoned in a gilded cage felt anything like romance. Silence stretched between them, loaded with things neither said. When Lucian spoke again, his tone had shifted, still warm, but with an edge underneath like a velvet glove over steel knuckles. "Business doesn't stop because I've taken a wife, Clara. You knew this when you married me." "I knew you were busy. I didn't know I'd be locked in a villa like Rapunzel without the hair." "You're not locked in." His voice was patient, almost amused. "You're protected. There's a difference." "Is there?" Mara walked to the terrace door again, wrapped her fingers around the immovable handle. "Because I can't leave, Lucian. Any room, any door. I need a code or your fingerprint to go anywhere beyond this bedroom. It's for your safety. It's for your control." Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke, something dangerous had crept into his voice. Nothing overt, just a subtle shift in temperature that made Mara's survival instincts prickle to attention. We've discussed this. The world I operate in has enemies, people who would use you to hurt me. Until I'm certain no one knows about our marriage, you stay protected. Inside, where I can keep you safe. How long? Mara's free hand clenched into a fist against her thigh. How long until I'm allowed to be a person instead of a possession? You are not a possession. Now his voice was granite. You are my wife, my responsibility, and I will not have this conversation again, Mara. Not today. When then? When you come back? When you decide I've earned enough trust to open a door? When I decide it's safe. Absolute, final, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I have another meeting. We'll talk tomorrow when I return. Ti amo, cara mia. The line went dead before Mara could respond. She stared at the phone, anger and something colder twisting in her gut. Ti amo, I love you. Words Lucien said often, with apparent sincerity, as if love and captivity were perfectly compatible concepts. Maybe for him, they were. Mara had been 19 when her father died, leaving behind debt and disappointment in equal measure. 23 when her mother's diagnosis came, stage 3, spreading fast, insurance that covered almost nothing. She'd worked 3 jobs, sold everything that wasn't nailed down, and still watched the bills pile up like gravestones marking her failures. Then came Marco and Vincent, loan sharks with dead eyes and payment plans that involved things she wouldn't survive intact. She'd been 2 weeks from something terrible when Lucien appeared at the diner's counter, ordered black coffee he didn't drink, and asked why she looked like someone being hunted. She told him. Everything. Because what did it matter? He was just another wealthy stranger slumming in Brooklyn, and she was too exhausted to maintain pretense. 2 days later, her mother's medical bills vanished, paid in full, anonymously. Marco and Vincent stopped calling. The eviction notice disappeared from her apartment door, and Lucien kept coming back to the diner, drinking coffee and asking questions with genuine interest, as if Mara's thoughts on philosophy or art or the weather actually mattered to a man who wore suits worth more than her annual rent. She should have known better, should have questioned why someone like him would care about someone like her. But desperation made you stupid. And Lucien had been patient, charming. He'd courted her properly. Dinners, museums, long conversations that stretched into dawn. He'd met her mother, brought flowers, sat through chemotherapy appointments, reading aloud from novels while Mara worked. He'd been kind without expecting anything in return. Until the night her mother died and Mara shattered into so many pieces she couldn't imagine ever being whole again. Lucien had held her through it. Arranged the funeral, stood beside her at the graveside, while rain turned the cemetery into a reflection of her grief. And when she'd whispered that she had nothing left, no family, no money, no reason to keep fighting, he'd tilted her chin up and said, "Then let me give you a reason. Marry me." She'd said yes because saying no meant being alone, and she couldn't bear that. She'd said yes because he'd saved her when no one else could. She'd said yes because love and gratitude tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart, and it seemed close enough to the same thing. The wedding had been small, private, just them and a handful of witnesses in a courthouse that smelled of floor polish and institutional despair. Lucien had slipped a platinum band on her finger and promised to love her, protect her, cherish her. She'd promised the same, meaning some of it, hoping the rest would come with time. Then he'd brought her here, to this villa overlooking paradise, with its locked doors and watchful staff, and the gradual, creeping realization that she'd traded one kind of cage for another. Mara set her phone down and walked to the closet. Her clothes hung beside Lucien's, designer dresses she'd never chosen, shoes that cost more than her old monthly salary, jewelry that felt heavy with obligation. All gifts, all carefully selected by someone who thought he knew what she needed better than she did. She pulled out jeans and a simple black shirt, her own clothes from before that she'd insisted on keeping despite Lucien's gentle suggestions that she didn't need them anymore. She dressed quickly, then knelt beside the bed and pulled out the small duffel bag she'd hidden under the bed frame. Inside, her passport, cash she'd been skimming from household expenses for 2 weeks, a burner phone she'd bought from a village shop during the one supervised trip into town Lucien's driver had permitted. Not much, but enough to disappear if she could just get past the locks. She'd been planning this since the third night in the villa when she'd woken at 2 a.m. to find Lucian standing at the window, speaking rapid Italian into his phone. She hadn't understood most of it, but certain words needed no translation. Debts, consequences. Make sure he understands. The cold, casual tone in which he'd discussed someone's suffering. That's when she'd stopped making excuses. Stopped telling herself that Lucian was just a businessman who happened to be very private, very protective, very good at avoiding questions about what exactly his company did. She'd married a dangerous man, and dangerous men didn't let their possessions walk away. But Mara had learned something about survival in the years since her father died. You didn't wait for permission to save yourself. You found the cracks in the system and you exploited them. You became smaller, quieter, smarter than the people trying to control you. And you sure as hell didn't announce your plans. She'd studied the security systems for days. The cameras in the halls, the motion sensors, the guards who patrolled on precise schedules. There was a service entrance at the villa's lowest level, used by housekeeping and deliveries. It had a manual lock, old-fashioned, mechanical, probably forgotten in Lucian's obsessive electronic upgrades. If she could get there during the afternoon shift change, when the guards were transitioning and the cameras had a 7-minute gap in coverage while the system reset itself, she might slip through. And then what? Run to the village, catch a bus to Naples, disappear into a city large enough to swallow her? Use the fake name she'd created, the identity she'd been building piece by piece. It was a terrible plan. Probably doomed, but staying was guaranteed doom. At least running gave her a chance. Mara checked her watch, 2:47 p.m., shift change at 3 o'clock. She had 13 minutes. She pulled on sneakers, shouldered the duffel, and took one last look around the bedroom. Beautiful, expensive, suffocating. A monument to everything Lucian thought love looked like. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The villa was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines, white stone, and windows that framed the coastline like living paintings. Mara's footsteps whispered across polished floors as she made her way toward the back stairs, heart hammering against her ribs. A maid passed, arms full of fresh linens, and nodded politely without breaking stride. Mara nodded back, keeping her expression calm, bored, just another restless afternoon in paradise. Down one flight, then another. The service level was less pristine, functional instead of beautiful, with concrete floors and industrial lighting. She could hear voices ahead, kitchen staff preparing dinner, and steered away from them toward the delivery entrance at the eastern wing. Almost there. Almost. Signora Moretti! Mara froze, every muscle locking up. She turned slowly to find Antonio, Lucian's head of security, standing at the corridor intersection. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that gave away nothing. He looked at her, then at the duffel bag, and his expression didn't change by a single degree. Going somewhere? His English was perfect, accent-free. Just exploring. Mara forced herself to meet his eyes, to smile like this was nothing. The villa is beautiful. I wanted to see more of it. With luggage. A change of clothes. In case I wanted to sit by the pool. Antonio studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside, gesturing down the corridor away from the exit. The pool is that direction, Signora. I'd be happy to escort you. It wasn't a suggestion. Mara's mind raced through options, run, scream, fight, all of them stupid, all of them ending badly. Antonio probably weighed twice what she did and had training she couldn't match. And even if she got past him, there were cameras, other guards, locked gates between her and freedom. The trap had already sprung. She just hadn't heard it click shut until now. Actually, Mara said quietly, I think I'll just go back to my room. Of course. Antonio nodded, sympathetic but immovable. I'll walk with you, ensure you don't get lost. They climbed the stairs in silence, Mara's brief spark of hope dying with each step. At the bedroom door, Antonio paused and met her eyes with something that might have been pity under different circumstances. Mr. Moretti cares deeply for your safety, Signora. We all do. Please understand that. I understand perfectly, Mara said, and meant it. She understood that care and control were interchangeable in Lucian's world. That protection meant imprisonment. That everyone in this villa answered to him, not her, no matter what the wedding vows had implied about partnership. She went inside and closed the door. Heard Antonio's footsteps retreat, then stop, stationing himself in the hallway. A guard now, not just security, making sure the asset stayed exactly where it belonged. Mara dropped the duffel on the floor and sank onto the bed, staring at nothing. The plan had failed before it even began. Of course it had. Lucian hadn't built an empire by leaving loose ends. She'd been naive to think otherwise. Her phone buzzed again. Not Lucian this time, a text from an unknown number. I know what you tried to do. We'll discuss it when I return tomorrow. Don't make this worse for yourself, Clara. Mara's hand shook as she read it twice, 3 times. Antonio must have called him immediately. Of course he had. Loyalty to the boss always trumped sympathy for the desperate wife. She typed and deleted 5 different responses before settling on silence. What was there to say? Apologies would sound hollow. Defiance would be pointless. Lucian had made his position clear. She was his, and his things didn't leave without permission. The afternoon bled into evening. Carlotta brought dinner on a tray, something elaborate that Mara couldn't taste past the ashes in her mouth. The sun set in a glory of orange and purple, turning the sea into liquid fire, and all Mara could think was how it looked like freedom burning. Night fell. She showered, changed into pajamas, lay in the enormous bed that smelled of Lucian's cologne. Sleep felt impossible, but exhaustion pulled her under anyway, dragging her into dreams of running through locked doors, of drowning in deep water while someone she couldn't see held her down with gentle, implacable hands. She woke to darkness and the certainty that she wasn't alone. Lucian sat in the chair by the window, silhouetted against moonlight, watching her with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. You weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow, Mara whispered, hating how her voice shook. Plans changed. He stood, crossed to the bed, sat on the edge close enough that she could feel his body heat. You tried to leave me. Not a question. An accusation wrapped in something that sounded almost like hurt. I tried to leave the villa, Mara corrected, sitting up, pulling the sheets around herself like armor. There's a difference. No, Clara, there really isn't. Lucian reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with devastating gentleness. You are my wife. This villa is your home. Leaving one means leaving the other, leaving me. This isn't a home, Lucian. It's a prison. It's protection. You keep saying that like it changes anything. Mara jerked away from his touch, anger finally overwhelming fear. You lock me in. You monitor my every move. You have guards watching me like I'm some kind of criminal. You're not a criminal. His voice stayed calm, reasonable, which somehow made it worse. You're precious, irreplaceable, and there are people in this world who would hurt you to hurt me. I won't allow that. So I'm supposed to just accept being locked up indefinitely? Is that the deal? The deal, Lucian said softly, dangerously, is that you made vows, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. Did you mean them, Mara? Or were you just saying words? The question hit like a slap. Because the truth was complicated, she'd meant them in the moment, drowning in grief and gratitude, thinking that marrying Lucian meant safety and partnership and maybe, eventually, something like love. She hadn't understood what he was, what he did, the kind of world she was agreeing to enter. I meant them, she said finally. But I didn't know what I was promising. You never told me the truth about who you are. You never asked, because you made sure I didn't have to. Mara shoved the sheets aside, stood, put distance between them even though there was nowhere to go. You paid off my debts. You swooped in like some kind of fairy tale hero. You made everything so easy that I didn't think to question it. That was deliberate, Lucian. You wanted me grateful and dependent and not looking too closely at the man behind the curtain. He watched her pace, expression unreadable in the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that she had to strain to hear it. I wanted you safe. I wanted you free of the vultures circling your life. And yes, I wanted you for myself. Is that so terrible? To see something beautiful and broken and want to protect it? I'm not a thing to collect, Mara spat. I'm a person with my own thoughts and needs and the right to make my own goddamn choices. You chose me. I chose the man you pretended to be. She spun to face him fully, letting him see the fury she'd been swallowing for weeks. The kind, patient businessman who read to my dying mother. Not whoever you become when you think I'm not watching. Not the man who talks about consequences and debts and makes people disappear when they inconvenience you. Silence crashed between them. Lucian stood slowly, and despite herself, despite everything, Mara took a step back. Because she'd seen glimpses of who he really was. The cold calculation, the absolute authority, the casual relationship with violence, and part of her, the part that had survived her father's failures and her mother's death and loan sharks with broken bottle smiles, knew she was playing with something that could destroy her without breaking a sweat. But she was done being afraid. Done shrinking. Tell me the truth, she demanded. All of it. What do you really do, Lucian? What's the business you're always handling? Because I don't think it's international real estate. He studied her for a long moment, moonlight carving his features into something almost inhuman, beautiful and terrible and utterly remote. Then he smiled, and it was the saddest thing Mara had ever seen. You want the truth, Cara Mia? Fine. I'll give you truth. He walked to the window, looked out at the dark sea. My family has controlled certain interests along the Mediterranean for 4 generations. Shipping, import-export. Protection services for businesses that operate outside traditional legal frameworks. We ensure debts are paid, contracts are honored, and territorial boundaries are respected. We are very, very good at what we do. Mara's stomach dropped. You're Mafia. Such an ugly word. Lucian turned back to her, and his eyes were emptier than she'd ever seen them. I prefer businessman with unconventional methods. But yes, if you need a simple label, that works. Oh my God. She pressed a hand to her mouth, nausea rising. You're a criminal, a crime lord, and I married you. You married a man who loves you, Lucian corrected sharply. Who would burn the world down to keep you safe, who paid off your debts, yes, but also sat with you through grief and held you when you fell apart and promised to spend his life making sure you never hurt like that again. The methods don't change the feeling, Mara. The methods are everything. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand how fundamentally broken his logic was. You can't claim to love someone and then trap them like an animal. I'm not trapping you. I'm protecting you from consequences you don't understand. Then explain them. Mara strode toward him, closing the distance, refusing to back down. Stop treating me like I'm too fragile or stupid to handle reality. You want me to trust you? Start by trusting me with the truth. Lucian stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes, surprise maybe, or recognition, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time since the wedding. All right, he said slowly. You want to understand my world? I'll show you. But once you see it, Clara, you can't unsee it, and you might wish you'd stayed safely ignorant in our beautiful prison. I'll take my chances. Will you? He stepped closer, until she could feel the heat of him, the coiled danger that always lurked beneath his civilized surface. Because once you know, once you're truly part of this, there's no walking away. You'll be in too deep, complicit, mine in every way that matters. Mara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. I stopped being yours the moment you locked me in, Lucian. Show me your world. Help me understand why you think this is love, and then let me decide for myself what happens next. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just looked at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, dangerous and fascinating in equal measure. Then he pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke rapid Italian she couldn't follow. When he hung up, his expression had shifted into something harder, colder. The mask of the civilized man dropping away to reveal the predator underneath. Get dressed, he said. Something you can move in. We leave in 10 minutes. Where are we going? Lucian smiled, and it had nothing warm in it anymore. To see what kind of monster you married. Mara dressed in silence while Lucian made more calls, his voice a low murmur of commands that she didn't try to decipher. Her hands shook as she pulled on jeans and a dark sweater, but she forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain the composure she'd claimed just minutes ago. She'd demanded truth. Now she'd have to survive it. The villa transformed after midnight. What had seemed like a luxury estate in daylight revealed itself as something else entirely. Once darkness fell, and pretense dropped away. Guards materialized from shadows, armed and alert, nodding to Lucian with the deference of soldiers acknowledging their commander. The electronic locks disengaged at his fingerprint, doors opening smoothly to reveal the world beyond her cage. Mara had wanted freedom. Instead, she was getting education. A black SUV waited in the circular drive, engine purring, windows tinted dark enough to swallow light. Antonio held the rear door open, his expression carefully neutral as Mara climbed in beside Lucian. No pity now. Just professional detachment, as if escorting the boss's wife into the underworld was simply another evening's work. The door closed with a heavy thunk that sounded terribly final. Lucian didn't touch her as the vehicle pulled away from the villa, winding down narrow roads that clung to cliff sides like uncertain promises. He simply sat in the darkness beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from his body, the controlled stillness of a man preparing for violence. "Where are we going?" Mara asked finally, unable to bear the silence. "Sorrento. There's a situation that requires my attention." Lucian glanced at her, his face half lit by passing streetlights. "A man who borrowed money from my organization 6 months ago. He was given generous terms, reasonable interest, multiple extensions when his business struggled. Now he's 3 payments behind and avoiding my calls. So you're going to hurt him. I'm going to remind him that debts have consequences." Lucian's voice was matter-of-fact, discussing broken bones the way other men might discuss broken contracts. "And you're going to watch, since you wanted to understand my world." Mara's stomach clenched, but she didn't look away from him. "And if I ask you not to? If I say this is wrong, and you should just forgive the debt? Then I'd explain that forgiveness in my business is perceived as weakness, and weakness gets you killed." He shifted to face her more fully. "Do you know what happens when a crime family shows mercy, Clara? When they let debts slide and insults go unanswered? Other families see opportunity. They push boundaries, test limits, take what isn't theirs, and suddenly you're fighting a war on 6 fronts because you were too soft-hearted to break one man's fingers. That's horrifying. That's reality." Lucian reached out, traced her jawline with one finger, the gesture almost tender despite the brutal conversation. "I didn't make these rules, Mara. I inherited them. And I follow them because the alternative is watching everyone I care about die while I cling to principles that mean nothing to men with guns." She wanted to argue, to find the moral high ground and plant her flag there. But the truth was more complicated than her anger allowed. She'd grown up watching her father make one soft-hearted decision after another, lending money he couldn't spare, trusting people who betrayed him, refusing to push back when others took advantage. His kindness had destroyed him, left his family with nothing but debt and disappointment. Maybe Lucian's brutality was just the opposite end of the same spectrum. Different survival strategy, same desperate math. The SUV descended from coastal roads into the dense urban sprawl of Sorrento, navigating streets that grew progressively narrower and darker until Mara lost all sense of direction. They stopped in an industrial area that smelled of fish and diesel, warehouses looming like sleeping giants against the night sky. Antonio opened the door. Lucian stepped out smoothly, buttoning his jacket with the casual precision of a man dressing for dinner rather than debt collection. Mara followed on unsteady legs, every instinct screaming at her to run, to refuse, to close her eyes against whatever was coming next. But she'd demanded this, and she'd be damned if she'd flinch now. 4 other men waited by a warehouse entrance, all dressed in dark clothes that seemed designed to absorb light and attention. They straightened when Lucian approached, one of them stepping forward with a deferential nod. "Mr. Moretti, he's inside. Still insists he doesn't have the money." "Then we'll discuss alternatives." Lucian glanced back at Mara, extended his hand. "Stay close to me. Don't speak unless I tell you to. And remember, you asked for this." His hand was warm and steady when she took it, the contrast between his gentle touch and the violence ahead making her dizzy with cognitive dissonance. How could the same fingers that had wiped away her tears now be leading her towards something monstrous? The warehouse interior was cavernous and cold, lit by harsh fluorescence that turned everything the color of old bruises. In the center of the space, a man knelt on concrete, hands zip-tied behind his back, face already showing signs of persuasion, split lip, swelling eye, the desperate terror of someone who'd run out of options. He looked up when Lucian entered, and something worse than fear crossed his face. Recognition, understanding that the final authority had arrived and mercy wasn't on the table. "Mr. Moretti, please. I just need more time." "You've had 6 months, Paolo." Lucian's voice was almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrible. 6 months and 3 extensions. I've been remarkably patient. "The restaurant. It's not making money like I projected. The tourists, they're not coming this season." "Your business problems are not my concern." Lucian circled the kneeling man slowly, and Mara noticed how everyone else in the warehouse had gone still, attentive, waiting for orders. "My concern is the 50,000 euros you borrowed, plus interest, which we agreed was fair. Where's my money, Paolo?" "I don't have it. I swear if I had it, then we have a problem." Lucian stopped circling, looked down at the man with something almost like sympathy. "Because I can't let you walk away from this debt. Other people are watching, you understand? They see how I handle you, and they decide whether to take me seriously or test my patience. So I need you to help me send the right message." Paolo was crying now, ugly, desperate sobs that echoed off concrete. "Please, I have a family, 2 daughters. They need a father who pays his debts." Lucian crouched down, eye level with the broken man. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over the deed to your restaurant. It won't cover the full amount you owe, but I'll accept it as partial payment. Then you're going to work for one of my associates until the rest is paid off. Understood? The restaurant is all I have." "No." Lucian's voice dropped to something colder than winter. "Your life is all you have. The restaurant is just a building. Your kneecaps are just bones. Your daughter's safety is just a circumstance I'm currently allowing. Don't confuse these things, Paolo. Not tonight." The threat hung in the air like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Mara felt bile rise in her throat, the casual way Lucian weaponized a man's family turning her stomach. But she'd asked to see this, to understand what kind of monster she'd married. Now she knew. Paolo nodded frantically, broken and defeated. "Yes, okay, I'll sign whatever you want." "Smart man." Lucian stood, gestured to one of his men. "Get him a lawyer. Make it official." "And Paolo? If you run, if you miss a single payment, if you even think about going to the police, well, you have daughters. I'd hate for them to grow up wondering what happened to their father." It wasn't a question. It was a promise wrapped in velvet menace, the kind of threat that didn't need elaboration because everyone understood exactly what it meant. One of Lucian's men pulled Paolo to his feet, cut the zip ties, handed him a pen and documents that had apparently been prepared in advance. The broken man signed with shaking hands, tears dripping onto legal paper, his entire life condensing down to black ink and coerced signature. Mara watched it happen and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was what Lucian did. Who he was when stripped of charm and expensive suits and the pretense of civilization. He destroyed people methodically, efficiently, with just enough mercy to call it business instead of sadism. And he'd brought her here to witness it, to understand that his love came wrapped in the same ruthless calculation as his threats. The signing complete, Paolo was escorted out by 2 guards, stumbling like a man in shock. Lucian watched him go with the detached interest of someone observing a completed transaction, then turned to Mara. "Still want to understand my world, Clara?" She couldn't speak, could barely breathe around the horror and disgust rising in her throat, but she met his eyes and refused to look away because she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I understand perfectly," she managed. "You're a bully with expensive lawyers, a predator who targets desperate people and calls it business." Something flickered in Lucian's expression. Disappointment, maybe, or anger. "I'm a man who operates in a system I didn't create." Paolo knew the terms when he borrowed. No one forced him to take my money. No one had to. That's the genius of it, isn't it? Find people desperate enough to agree to anything, then punish them for being desperate in the first place. I gave him options, work or suffer. That's more mercy than most would show. "Mercy?" Mara laughed. brittle and harsh. You threatened his children, Lucien. You took the one thing he'd built and crushed it because he couldn't pay fast enough. That's not mercy. That's cruelty with a business card. The warehouse had gone very quiet. Lucien's men were staring now, barely concealing their shock that anyone would speak to their boss this way. Antonio shifted closer, hand drifting toward his jacket, where Mara suspected a weapon lived, waiting for orders. But Lucien just studied her with an expression she couldn't read, some complex mixture of frustration and fascination, as if she was a puzzle that kept reshaping itself every time he thought he'd solved it. "We're leaving," he said finally, turning toward the exit without waiting to see if she'd follow. "I have other business tonight. You'll see more before dawn." Mara wanted to refuse, to plant herself on this concrete floor and demand to be taken back to the villa, back to ignorant captivity that at least didn't require watching human beings be systematically broken. But Antonio was already moving toward her with polite inevitability, and the door was closing on choices she'd never really had. She followed Lucien into the night. The next 3 stops blurred together in a nightmare progression of violence disguised as business. A gambling den where a man who'd skimmed profits was shown what happened to thieves. Lucien, watching with clinical detachment while his enforcers delivered carefully calculated brutality, enough to send a message without causing permanent damage. A shipping office where falsified customs documents were discovered, and the responsible party was given exactly one chance to explain himself before disappearing into a back room with men who didn't believe in second chances. A restaurant where the owner paled when Lucien arrived unannounced, immediately producing an envelope thick with cash, stammering apologies for the delayed payment, promising it would never happen again. Through it all, Lucien remained eerily calm. No rage, no sadistic pleasure, just cool efficiency as he moved through his empire, ensuring every gear turned exactly as designed. He could have been a CEO, conducting performance reviews. If CEOs measured productivity in fear and compliance, and the creative application of violence. Mara watched it all with growing numbness, her capacity for horror maxing out somewhere around the 3rd broken promise and 2nd broken bone. This was Lucien's world. This was what he did when he left her locked in the villa, conducting business that required personal attention. This was the man she'd married. Dawn was threatening the horizon when they finally stopped moving, the SUV pulling up to a cliffside overlook north of the city. Lucien dismissed Antonio and the others with a gesture, then stepped out into pre-dawn stillness that felt almost sacred after the night's brutality. Mara joined him at the cliff's edge, exhausted and hollowed out, staring at the sea turning from black to gray as light crept across the water. "Well?" Lucien's voice was quiet, almost tentative. "Now you've seen it. The monster you married. Still want your freedom, Clara? Still think you can walk away from this world and build something clean?" She should say yes, should demand divorce papers and witness protection and a one-way ticket to anywhere he wasn't, should recognize that staying meant complicity, that knowing what she now knew made her an accessory to everything she'd witnessed. But Mara had learned something tonight too, something about herself that was almost as disturbing as Lucien's casual brutality. "You didn't enjoy it," she said finally. "Any of it. I watched you all night, and you never smiled, never took pleasure in their pain. It was just work. Necessary, in your mind, but not enjoyable." Lucien glanced at her sharply, surprised. "Does that matter?" "I don't know." Mara wrapped her arms around herself against the morning chill. "Maybe. The loan sharks who came after me, they enjoyed it, smiled while they threatened, got off on the fear. You're cold, Lucien, ruthless, but not sadistic. There's a difference." "Quite the distinction," he said dryly. "I'm a compassionate monster. That should comfort you." "It doesn't." She turned to face him fully. "But it tells me something about why you think locking me up equals love. You genuinely believe you're protecting me. In your broken, twisted logic, the cage is kindness." "It is." Lucien reached for her, then stopped himself, hand falling back to his side. "You have no idea what my enemies would do if they knew about you. The rival families who'd see you as leverage, the federal agents who'd use you to get to me, the dozens of people I've destroyed over the years who'd love nothing more than to hurt me through you. The villa isn't a prison, Mara. It's a fortress. And I'd rather you hate me safely inside than love me and end up dead." There was real pain in his voice now, the first genuine emotion she'd heard from him since the warehouse. And despite everything, despite the horror she'd witnessed and the disgust still churning in her gut, Mara felt something soften fractionally toward this impossible man. He was broken, shaped by a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished weakness, raised in a family business that treated love as liability and violence as vocabulary. He didn't know how to protect without controlling, how to love without possessing, because no one had ever shown him the difference. "I don't want to end up dead," Mara said carefully, "but I don't want to live like a ghost either. What you're offering isn't life, Lucien. It's existence. Beautiful, empty existence in a cage made of your fear. My fear keeps you breathing." "Does it? Or does it just make you feel like you have control over something in a world that's fundamentally chaotic?" She stepped closer, made him look at her. "You can't lock away every threat. You can't eliminate every risk. Something will always slip through. A rival who's smarter, a cop who's more persistent, a random variable you didn't account for. And when that happens, I'll be trapped inside your fortress with no skills, no knowledge, no ability to protect myself because you've kept me so carefully ignorant." Lucian's jaw tightened. "So what do you suggest? I throw open the gates and hope for the best?" "I suggest you trust me." Mara held his gaze, willing him to understand. "Teach me about your world instead of hiding me from it. Let me learn to protect myself instead of depending entirely on you. Give me agency, Lucian. Partnership, not this half-life where I'm simultaneously treasured and imprisoned." "You don't know what you're asking." "Then explain it to me." Frustration boiled over, all the fear and anger and exhaustion of the endless night finally erupting. "Stop treating me like I'm made of glass. I survived poverty and debt collectors and watching my mother die by inches. I'm stronger than you think. But you'll never know that because you won't give me a chance to prove it." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of waves against rocks far below and the lonely cry of seabirds greeting the dawn. Lucian stood very still, and Mara could see the war happening behind his eyes, fear battling control, love wrestling with possession, the desperate need to keep her safe colliding with the growing realization that safety wasn't enough if she was miserable. "If I do this," he said finally, voice rough with something that might have been desperation, "if I give you more freedom, teach you how to navigate my world, you can't leave. Not ever. Because once you know these things, once you're truly inside, there's no walking away. The information alone makes you a target. Do you understand what I'm saying, Mara? You'd be trapped more permanently than any lock could manage." "I understand." And she did, with terrifying clarity. This was the bargain: knowledge and agency in exchange for permanent entanglement. Freedom within the cage, but the cage itself would only grow larger, never disappear entirely. It wasn't what she wanted, but it might be the best she could get. "I need to think about this." Lucian turned back to the sea, silhouette sharp against the growing light. "You're asking me to fundamentally change how I operate, how I protect what's mine." "I'm not yours," Mara said quietly, but with steel underneath. "That's the whole problem, Lucian. You keep using that word like I'm a possession. I'm your wife, your partner, supposedly, not your property. In my world, the distinction is academic. Then maybe your world needs to evolve." He laughed at that, short and bitter. "You want to reform the Mafia, Clara? Make us progressive and enlightened? Good luck with that." "I want to reform my marriage," Mara corrected. "The rest of your empire can rot for all I care. But us? This?" She gestured between them, encompassing all the broken, complicated mess of their relationship. "We need to be different, or there's no point staying." The threat hung implicit in the air. Lucian heard it. She could tell by the way his shoulders tensed, the muscle jumping in his jaw. He was used to controlling outcomes, bending reality to his will through force and fear and the careful application of violence. But he couldn't force her to love him, couldn't threaten her into genuine partnership. And for a man who'd spent his entire life making people bend, that impotence must have been torture. "I'll consider what you've said," he said finally, each word careful, measured. "But I make no promises. My first priority is keeping you alive. If that means you hate me, I'll learn to live with it." "Will you?" Mara challenged. "Because I don't think you brought me into your world tonight just to prove a point." I think you wanted me to understand so I'd stop fighting you. Stop demanding freedom you can't give. You wanted me to see the danger and retreat back into grateful captivity. Lucian turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable, like the mask had finally cracked enough to show the frightened man underneath. I wanted you to understand why I'm terrified, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Why every moment you're out of my sight, I imagine 100 different ways you could be taken from me. I've lost people, Mara, family, friends, a sister I couldn't protect, and I swore I'd never be that helpless again, that I'd never care about someone I couldn't keep safe. The confession hit like a physical blow, knocking loose all the righteous anger Mara had been nursing. Because underneath the brutality and control, underneath the monster who threatened children and broke bones for missed payments, was just a man who'd been broken by loss and rebuilt himself wrong. She understood that. She'd done the same thing after her mother died. Constructed walls and defenses, tried to make herself invulnerable to future pain. The only difference was that Lucian had money and power and an entire criminal organization to facilitate his particular brand of broken. I'm sorry about your sister, Mara said quietly. But punishing me for what happened to her isn't fair. I'm not her. And you can't prevent every possible tragedy by building higher walls. I can try. You can suffocate us both trying. She moved closer, close enough to touch him, but still holding back. There has to be a middle ground, Lucian. Some version of this marriage where I'm not locked up, but you're not spiraling into paranoid terror every time I leave a room. We have to find it. Because this? She gestured at the space between them, all the hurt and fear and desperate need. This isn't sustainable. The sun finally broke the horizon, spilling gold across the water, painting them both in light that felt almost hopeful. Almost. Lucian reached out, cupped her face with surprising gentleness, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I don't know how to do this differently, he admitted. I don't know how to love without controlling. Without protecting so hard, it becomes imprisonment. Then we'll learn together, Mara said, leaning into his touch despite every rational instinct screaming at her to run. But you have to try, Lucian. Really try. Not just pay lip service while keeping all the locks engaged. And if I can't? If this is who I am fundamentally? She met his eyes, saw the question behind the question. Saw him asking whether she'd stay, even if he couldn't change, couldn't become the man she needed him to be. The honest answer was she didn't know. But dawn was breaking, and they were both exhausted from a night that had peeled back every comfortable lie. And sometimes the only thing you could do was choose to stay one more day and see what happened. Then we'll deal with that when it comes, Mara said finally. But right now, I need you to take me back to the villa and let me sleep. And when I wake up, we're going to start over. No more locked doors, no more guards watching my every move. We try this your way for a while. You teach me about your world, I learn to navigate it safely. And we see if there's any version of us that can survive honest light. Lucian studied her for a long moment, searching for something she wasn't sure she was giving. Then he nodded slowly, a man agreeing to terms he didn't entirely believe in but couldn't refuse. One condition, he said. You go nowhere without Antonio or someone from my security team. Not until I'm convinced the other families don't know about you. That's non-negotiable. It wasn't freedom, but it was more than she'd had yesterday. Deal, Mara agreed. They drove back to the villa in silence, both too drained for more conversation, more negotiation, more of the exhausting emotional combat that seemed to define every interaction. The sun climbed higher, burning off morning mist, revealing a world that looked exactly the same as yesterday, despite everything that had changed between them. At the villa, Carlotta was already awake, preparing breakfast as if the night's events had been perfectly ordinary. Maybe in this world, they were. Maybe horror became mundane when you lived with it long enough, witnessed enough broken men and coerced signatures and casual violence disguised as business. Mara couldn't decide if that was comforting or terrifying. She showered, washing off the night with water too hot, trying to scald away the memory of Paolo's tears and the sound of bones breaking and Lucian's cold, efficient destruction of anyone who crossed him. But some stains went deeper than skin, settled into the soul where water couldn't reach. When she emerged, Lucian was asleep in their bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking younger and more vulnerable, than she'd ever seen him. One arm stretched across the mattress to her side, as if reaching for her even in sleep. Mara stood in the doorway for a long time, watching this complicated, broken man who loved her wrong, who destroyed people and called it protection, who'd shown her horrors tonight and somehow still expected her to stay. The smart thing would be to run, to wait until he was deeply asleep, then slip out quietly and never look back. Find the American consulate in Naples, beg for help, disappear into witness protection, or a new life, or anything that didn't involve blood and locked doors and the constant threat of violence. But Mara had never been particularly smart, just stubborn. She climbed into bed beside her monster husband and let exhaustion pull her under. Mara woke to find Lucian gone and the bedroom door standing open for the first time since their honeymoon began. Sunlight poured through the terrace windows. No longer locked, she noticed, testing the handle and finding it turned smoothly under her palm. The door swung open to reveal the Mediterranean stretched vast and blue beyond the balcony railing. Freedom so close she could taste salt air on her tongue. She stood there for a long moment, half expecting alarms to sound or guards to materialize, but nothing happened. Just wind and sun and the distant cry of gulls wheeling over the cliffs. Lucian had kept his word, at least about the locks. It was a start. Downstairs, she found him in his office, a room she'd glimpsed only in passing before. All dark wood and leather, walls lined with books in Italian and English, a massive desk covered with documents and laptop screens showing what looked like shipping manifests and financial spreadsheets. He looked up when she entered, and something complicated crossed his face. Relief, maybe, or surprise that she was still here. "You slept for 14 hours, he said, closing the laptop. "I was beginning to worry." Long night. Mara moved into the room cautiously, still half expecting the open door to be some kind of test. The terrace was unlocked. Yes. The bedroom door, too. I gave instructions to the security team. You have access to the villa and grounds. Antonio will accompany you if you want to go into town. Lucian stood, circled the desk to lean against it, arms crossed. "I'm trying, Mara, like you asked." She heard the uncertainty underneath his words, the unspoken question of whether this would be enough, whether anything he did could bridge the chasm between who he was and who she needed him to be. "I know," she said softly. "Thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people who'd shared a bed and vows but were still fundamentally strangers navigating a minefield of unspoken expectations and incompatible worldviews. Finally, Lucian gestured to a chair. "Sit. If I'm going to teach you about my world, we should start with the basics." For the next 3 hours, he talked, and Mara listened, taking mental notes as he outlined the structure of his organization with the clinical precision of a professor lecturing on corporate hierarchy. There were the legitimate businesses, shipping companies, import-export firms, restaurants and hotels that generated real revenue and provided cover for less legal operations. Then there were the shadow enterprises, protection rackets, loan operations, gambling dens, and what Lucian delicately called conflict resolution services that sounded a lot like contract violence. The Moretti family controlled a significant portion of the Campania region's underworld, maintaining uneasy truces with rival families through a combination of mutual profit and mutually assured destruction. Territorial boundaries were respected, disputes were arbitrated through a council of bosses, and everyone understood that starting wars was bad for business. "It's surprisingly bureaucratic," Mara observed. "All these rules and hierarchies. I expected something more chaotic." "Chaos is expensive." Lucian pulled up a map on his laptop showing color-coded territories. "We learned that lesson in the 90s when family wars nearly destroyed everything. Now we operate more like corporations with occasional violence. Much more efficient." "You say that like it makes it better." "It does, for what it's worth. Fewer people die this way. More money gets made. Everyone prospers as long as they follow the rules." Mara studied the map, noting how Moretti territory pressed up against other family holdings like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. "What happens when someone breaks the rules?" "Depends on the severity. Minor infractions get warnings. Major violations require demonstrations." His voice went cold on that last word, and Mara remembered Paolo's broken expression, the casual way Lucian had threatened his daughters. The key is consistency. Everyone needs to know exactly where the boundaries are and what happens when you cross them. And you're the one who enforces this, personally? When necessary. Most of the day-to-day operations run themselves. I have good people in key positions, but certain situations require my direct attention. Shows of strength, diplomatic negotiations, handling threats that could destabilize the entire structure. He paused, studying her expression. Like last night. Paolo wasn't just a debtor. He was a test case. Other people were watching to see if I'd gotten soft after getting married, if I'd lost my edge. Understanding clicked into place. That's why you brought me. You wanted them to see that having a wife hasn't changed you. Partially, but also I wanted you to see that this isn't some hobby I can walk away from. It's who I am, Mara. What I've been since I was 18 and my father was killed and the family needed someone to step up. His expression went distant, remembering. I didn't choose this life. It chose me. And I've spent the last 12 years making sure we survive in a world that would tear us apart if I showed any weakness. There was genuine pain in his voice, the weight of responsibility borne too young and carried too long. Mara felt her anger soften fractionally despite everything she'd witnessed, despite knowing the kind of man he'd become in service of that survival. Your sister, she said carefully. The one you mentioned. What happened to her? Lucian's face went completely blank, a door slamming shut. That's not relevant. It's relevant to why you're terrified of losing me, to why you think love equals control. Mara, I'm not asking to hurt you, Lucian. I'm asking to understand. She leaned forward, trying to catch his gaze. You've shown me your world. Let me see the person underneath the boss. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse. The silence stretched taut between them, filled with all the things he clearly didn't want to say, didn't want to remember. But then something crumbled in his expression, some carefully maintained wall finally cracking under pressure. Her name was Sophia, he said quietly. 3 years younger than me, smarter, kinder, everything good that our family managed to produce despite the business we were in. He stood, moved to the window, couldn't seem to look at Mara while saying this. She hated what we did, hated the violence and the corruption. When she turned 18, she told my father she wanted out, wanted to go to university in Rome, study art history, build a life that had nothing to do with crime families and territorial disputes. What did your father say? He said no. Said she knew too much, that letting her leave would make us vulnerable. That family meant loyalty, and loyalty meant staying. Lucian's hands clenched into fists against the window frame. They fought for weeks, Sophia threatening to run away, my father threatening to disown her, both of them too stubborn to compromise. And I just watched, too much of a coward to take either side. Mara's chest tightened, already sensing where this was going, the tragedy that had shaped the man standing before her. She ran anyway, Lucian continued, voice hollow. Packed a bag one night and disappeared. We found her 3 days later in a warehouse owned by the Russo family, one of our rivals. They'd grabbed her to use as leverage, tried to force my father into giving up territory in exchange for her safe return. He finally turned to face Mara, and his eyes were devastated, haunted by ghosts he'd never be able to save. My father refused. Said negotiating with terrorists, that's what he called them, would show weakness, that we'd get her back through force, through showing the Russos that taking a Moretti had consequences. What happened? We went to war. 2 weeks of violence that tore the city apart, and by the time we finally stormed the warehouse, Sophia was already dead. They'd killed her on day 5, dumped her body, and just kept stringing us along because the war was profitable for them. Good for business. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward to encompass everything Mara had witnessed about Lucian's fierce protectiveness, his need to control, his absolute terror of losing someone he loved. I'm so sorry, she whispered, inadequate but sincere. I was 21 when she died. My father was killed 6 months later in retaliation for what we did to the Russos during that war. And suddenly I was head of the family, responsible for keeping everyone alive, making sure Sophia's death meant something. Lucian's voice was raw, stripped of all the careful control he usually maintained. I swore I'd never let it happen again. Never let someone I cared about be vulnerable, be used, be hurt because I wasn't strong enough or ruthless enough to protect them. So you built a fortress, Mara said, understanding clicking into place. Around yourself, around everyone close to you, and you've been living in it ever since, keeping people at arm's length where they can't be used against you. Until you. He moved toward her, knelt in front of the chair so they were eye level, and the vulnerability in his face was almost unbearable. You walked into my life and I tried so hard not to care. Told myself I was just helping someone in need, that it didn't mean anything. But you were so brave, Mara. So determined to save your mother even when it was hopeless, working yourself to exhaustion, refusing to give up. And I saw Sophia in you, that same stubborn goodness, that same refusal to be broken by a cruel world. So you decided to save me the way you couldn't save her. I decided I couldn't live without you. His hands found hers, gripping tight. And that terrified me. Because everyone I love dies or gets used against me or leaves. So I did the only thing I knew how. I married you, brought you here, locked every door, and convinced myself that if I controlled every variable, you'd be safe. You'd stay. Mara felt tears burning her eyes, grief for this broken man and the sister he'd lost, and the impossible situation they'd both stumbled into. Because his love was genuine, she could see that now. Twisted and suffocating and expressed through control, but real nonetheless. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to prevent the kind of hurt that had destroyed him years ago. It didn't make the cage any less real, but it made it harder to hate him for building it. I'm not Sophia, she said gently. And I'm not going to die because you let me have some freedom, Lucian. The world isn't that perfectly malicious. You don't know that. My enemies are no more dangerous than the loan sharks who came after me in Brooklyn, than the desperation I faced every day before you showed up. I've lived with threats before. She squeezed his hands, making him focus. The difference is I had agency then. I could fight back, make choices, try to protect myself. Here, I'm just waiting for you to decide whether I've earned the right to be a person instead of a possession. You've always been a person to me. Then treat me like one, not Sophia, not a second chance or a redemption arc or a thing to protect. Me, Mara, your wife who's asking for partnership, not imprisonment. Lucian closed his eyes, and she could see the war happening inside him, fear battling hope, control wrestling with trust, 12 years of careful survival instinct screaming that letting her in meant making himself vulnerable again. I don't know if I can, he admitted, voice breaking on the words. Every instinct I have says this ends badly. That caring about you openly, letting you move freely, trusting you to protect yourself, it's all just a countdown to the moment someone takes you from me. Then we'll deal with that if it comes. Together. Mara stood, pulled him to his feet, made him look at her. But living in fear of hypothetical tragedy isn't living, Lucian. It's just a slower kind of dying. And I won't do it. I can't. Before he could respond, before she could second guess what she was about to offer, Mara made a decision that would either save them or destroy whatever fragile progress they'd made. Take me with you, she said. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you have business that requires your attention. Let me see all of it, not just the parts you think I can handle. If I'm going to be part of your world, truly part of it, I need to understand everything. The good, the bad, the morally complicated, all of it. Lucian stared at her like she'd suggested jumping off the cliff. That's insane. The things I do, the places I go, you could get hurt, Mara. Killed. Just being associated with me makes you a target. I'm already a target by being your wife. At least this way I'll know what I'm facing instead of being kept ignorant while you tell yourself it's protection. She stepped closer, willing him to understand. You want me safe? Teach me to be dangerous. You want me to stay? Give me a reason beyond locked doors and beautiful prisons. Show me that there's something in your world worth fighting for instead of running from. He looked at her for a long time, searching for something she hoped he'd find. Finally, he pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke rapid Italian that she still couldn't follow, but recognized the tone of commands being given, arrangements being made. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Tonight. There's a meeting with the other families to discuss territorial disputes in Naples. It'll be tense, possibly dangerous, definitely not something I'd ever bring a spouse to under normal circumstances. Good. Mara, these people are the same people who will eventually learn about me anyway. Better I meet them on our terms than have them discover me by accident. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. This is what you agreed to. Teaching me, showing me, treating me like a partner instead of a prisoner. So start. Something shifted in Lucian's expression then, some final resistance crumbling. He looked at her with what might have been respect or fear, or the desperate hope that maybe this impossible woman who demanded truth instead of comfortable lies might actually survive his world intact. Fine, he said, but you follow my lead, stay close. Don't speak unless I tell you to, and if things go wrong, I'll handle it, Mara interrupted. Stop trying to script every outcome, Lucian. Some things you just have to trust. The word hung between them, fragile and terrifying. Trust. The thing he'd spent 12 years avoiding, the vulnerability he'd sworn never to allow again. But he nodded anyway, and Mara knew she'd won something important. Not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. The promise that maybe, eventually, they could build something that didn't require locks and guards, and the constant suffocating pressure of his fear. The rest of the day passed in preparation that felt almost surreal. Carlotta appeared with a dress, elegant but understated, the kind of thing that would let Mara blend into a room full of criminals without standing out. Antonio briefed her on protocol with the detached efficiency of someone training a soldier for combat. Lucian disappeared for hours to handle business she wasn't privy to yet, returning only to tell her the meeting was confirmed for midnight at a restaurant in Naples' historic district. As evening fell, Mara stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a Brooklyn waitress drowning in debt and grief. Now she was preparing to walk into a room full of Mafia bosses as the wife of one of the most powerful crime lords in southern Italy. The absurdity of it should have been funny. Instead, it was just terrifying. She emerged to find Lucian waiting, looking devastating in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than her mother's entire medical care. He studied her appearance with approval, then handed her something small and heavy. What's this? Mara turned the object over in her hand. A phone. Expensive, but unremarkable. Emergency contact. Antonio's number is programmed in, along with several others. If we get separated or something goes wrong, you call them immediately. They'll get you out. Nothing's going to go wrong. Probably not, Lucian agreed. But I didn't survive 12 years in this business by assuming the best. Take the phone, Mara. Humor me. She slipped it into her purse alongside the useless phone she'd bought for her failed escape attempt. Insurance policies, both of them, different kinds of freedom that she might never need but felt better having. The drive to Naples took an hour through darkness that seemed to thicken as they left the coast behind. Antonio drove with Antonio in the front seat and 2 other guards following in a second vehicle. Mara watched lights streak past the windows and tried not to think about all the ways this night could go wrong. These other families, she said, breaking the silence. Should I be worried about them? Depends. The Russos still hate us for what happened after Sofia died, but they respect strength. The Calabrese family is pragmatic. They'll be polite as long as it serves their interests. The Benedettis are wild cards, ambitious and unpredictable. And the Martinellis are old guard traditionalists who think women shouldn't be seen at these meetings at all. So I'm going to be popular. You're going to be a statement, Lucian corrected. Bringing you tonight tells them I'm confident enough in my position to openly acknowledge my wife, that I'm not afraid of them knowing about you. It's a power move, Mara. Everything at these meetings is. She absorbed that, understanding the game being played even if she didn't know all the rules yet. What do they know about me? Nothing, until tonight. I've kept our marriage quiet specifically to avoid making you a target. But that stops being sustainable eventually. Someone would find out through other channels, and then it looks like I was hiding you out of fear. Better to control the narrative. By throwing me into a room full of criminals and seeing what happens. By showing them you're under my protection, that hurting you means war with the Morettis. It's insurance, of a sort. Mara wanted to argue, to point out that insurance policies that involved putting the insured in danger made no sense. But she'd asked for this, demanded to be part of his world instead of sheltered from it. Now she got to live with the consequences. The restaurant sat in a narrow street that looked medieval, all ancient stone and iron gates, seemingly abandoned until you noticed the expensive cars parked in carefully guarded spaces and the men with earpieces stationed at intervals along the block. Antonio pulled up to the entrance where two guards materialized immediately, checking credentials before waving them through. Inside, the restaurant had been cleared of regular patrons, leaving only a long table set for perhaps 20 people in a private dining room that reeked of old money and older violence. Crystal glinted under soft lighting, wine bottles worth more than cars waited to be opened, and the air itself seemed heavy with centuries of secrets and carefully negotiated peace. Men were already seated, most accompanied by one or two advisors, but no spouses, and the conversation died when Lucian entered with Mara on his arm. She felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure, dozens of predator eyes evaluating this unexpected variable, calculating what it meant that Moretti had brought a woman to counsel. Lucian guided her to seats near the head of the table with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he ranked in this hierarchy. As they sat, an older man with silver hair and eyes like winter moved into the chair opposite them, studying Mara with undisguised interest. "Lucian," the man said, voice smooth as poisoned honey, "you've brought a guest. How unexpected." "Russo." Lucian's tone was cordial, but cold. "May I introduce my wife, Mara Moretti? Mara, this is Giovanni Russo. His family controls most of the port operations in the region. The same Russo family whose warehouse had held Sophia captive, who'd killed her and sparked the war that had shaped Lucian into the man he'd become." Mara felt tension coil in her stomach but kept her expression carefully neutral, nodded politely. "A pleasure," she said, meaning none of it. Russo's smile sharpened. "The pleasure is mine, I assure you, though I confess surprised that Lucian has taken a bride. After what happened with his sister, I assumed he'd learned better than to give his enemies such obvious leverage." The threat was barely veiled, casual and conversational, and absolutely clear. Mara felt Lucian go very still beside her, that dangerous stillness that preceded violence. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Russo, you forget yourself." An elderly man at the head of the table spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a council meeting, not a boxing ring. We leave family grievances at the door, or we accomplish nothing." "Of course, Don Benedetti." Russo inclined his head respectfully, but his eyes never left Mara, calculating, measuring, looking for weakness. "I meant no offense, simply making conversation." The rest of the families filed in over the next few minutes, the room filling with dangerous men and carefully managed hostility. Introductions were made with varying degrees of warmth, everyone clearly curious about Lucian's wife, but too professional to make overt comments beyond Russo's opening salvo. Finally, Don Benedetti called the meeting to order, and for the next hour Mara listened to discussions that sounded like legitimate business negotiations right up until you paid attention to what was actually being said. Territorial boundaries being redrawn, percentages of profit from various enterprises being redistributed, disputes over who'd encroached on whose gambling operations or protection rackets. Everything couched in euphemism and corporate language, but underneath it all, the clear understanding that violence was always an option if negotiation failed. Lucian participated with calm authority, defending Moretti interests without appearing aggressive, conceding minor points while holding firm on major ones, navigating the complex politics with the skill of someone who'd spent years mastering this particular game. And through it all, Mara felt eyes on her, assessing, judging, wondering what kind of woman Moretti had chosen and whether that choice represented weakness or strength. She was about to find out which. The meeting was winding down, final agreements being reached, when the door burst open and men with guns flooded into the room. Mara's world narrowed to the sound of safeties clicking off, and the sudden, terrible stillness that fell over the room like a shroud. 6 men, maybe 7, all armed, all moving with the coordinated precision of professionals. Not random thugs. Soldiers. Lucian's hand found hers under the table, squeezed once, a warning or reassurance she couldn't tell which. Around them, the other bosses had frozen mid-gesture, wine glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations dying on tongues that suddenly remembered the taste of fear. The lead gunman stepped forward, face hidden behind a balaclava, weapon trained on Don Benedetti at the head of the table. When he spoke, his accent was thick, Eastern European maybe, words clipped and efficient. Nobody moves. Hands on table where we see them. You follow instructions. Maybe you lived through this. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then slowly, carefully, hands emerged from beneath the table and spread flat against white linen. Mara followed suit, her pulse hammering so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. This was real. This was happening. Men with guns had just walked into a room full of crime bosses, and the most powerful people in southern Italy's underworld were complying like sheep, because even predators recognized when they'd become prey. "Good," the gunman said, satisfaction in his voice. "Now, we have simple business. There is price on some heads in this room. We collect, we leave. Nobody else has to die. Easy, yes?" "Who sent you?" Don Benedetti's voice was steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "You understand what you're doing, who you're threatening." "We understand perfectly. That is why we bring so many guns." The gunman gestured to his team, who fanned out around the table, covering different angles. "Now, Lucien Moretti, stand up please, slowly." Mara's breath caught. Of course this was about Lucien. 12 years of making enemies, 12 years of breaking men like Paolo, and threatening families and enforcing debts with calculated violence. All of it leading to this moment when someone finally decided to collect their own debt. Lucien stood with the same controlled grace he brought to everything, hands still visible, expression utterly calm. "You're making a mistake. Whatever you're being paid, it's not enough to survive the consequences of this." Big talk for man with gun to his head. The leader moved closer, weapon never wavering. "On your knees, Moretti, hands behind back." "Lucien," Russo's voice cut through the tension, and Mara heard something almost like pleasure underneath the concern. "Perhaps you should comply. These men seem quite serious." "Shut up, Russo." This from Calabrese, the pragmatic family head who'd been cordial during introductions. "This concerns all of us. You let them execute a boss during council, next time it's your head they're collecting." "Unless I'm the one who hired them," Russo said quietly, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Lucien laughed, short and bitter. "Of course. Should have known you'd never let Sophia go. How long have you been planning this, Giovanni? Months? Years?" "Since the day you killed my nephew in retaliation for her death." Russo stood slowly, hands still on the table, playing this carefully. "You burned my warehouses, destroyed my supply lines, cost me millions in revenue and blood. And you thought I'd just accept that? That there wouldn't be a reckoning?" "Your people kidnapped and murdered a 19-year-old girl," Lucien said, voice dropping to something colder than winter. "What did you expect, flowers and forgiveness?" "I expected you to understand that this is business, not personal, that sometimes collateral damage happens in war." Russo's smile was cruel. "But you made it personal, Lucien. You always do. So I'm returning the favor." The gunman was getting impatient, weapon gesturing sharply. "Enough talking. On knees, Moretti. Now! Or we start with your pretty wife." The barrel swung toward Mara, and everything inside her went liquid with terror. She'd asked to see Lucien's world, demanded to be part of it, insisted she could handle whatever came. Now she was about to find out if that was true or just the brave delusion of someone who'd never actually faced death before. Lucien moved immediately, dropping to his knees, hands going behind his head. "Leave her alone. She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Russo corrected pleasantly. "She's leverage, insurance. The thing I learned from watching you, Lucien, love makes men weak, makes them compliant. So your wife lives as long as you cooperate. Simple mathematics." Around the table, the other families were watching with varying expressions: horror, calculation, the careful neutrality of people trying to determine which side would win before committing. Don Benedetti looked furious, but impotent, too old and too practical to start a gunfight he couldn't win. The Martinellis were stone-faced, probably already planning how to profit from whatever power vacuum Lucien's death would create. This was the world Mara had demanded to understand, where loyalty lasted exactly as long as it served self-interest, where violence was just another negotiating tool, where love was weakness and everyone you cared about became a weapon pointed at your own head. The gunman behind Lucian pulled out zip ties, moved to secure his hands. And in that moment of distraction, Antonio moved. He'd been standing against the wall with the other security personnel, positioned like furniture everyone had stopped noticing. Now he pulled a weapon from somewhere, fired twice in quick succession, and two of the gunmen dropped before anyone else could react. Then all hell broke loose. The remaining attackers opened fire, aiming for Antonio first, but hitting wine bottles and crystal and plaster as everyone dove for cover. The security teams for the other families drew weapons, some firing at the attackers, others covering their bosses, chaos erupting in the confined space like a grenade had detonated. Lucian grabbed Mara and pulled her down beneath the table, his body covering hers as bullets chewed through wood and glass above them. She could hear screaming, the meaty impact of rounds finding flesh, Russo shouting orders that were lost in the cacophony. "Stay down!" Lucian hissed in her ear. "Don't move until I tell you." Then he was gone, rolling away from her, and Mara caught a glimpse of him grabbing a fallen weapon from one of the dead attackers. He came up firing with the cold precision she'd witnessed in the warehouse, putting rounds into targets with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before, many times, and was very, very good at it. The fight lasted maybe 90 seconds, but felt eternal. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse, filled with groaning and the wet sounds of people dying, the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood turning the elegant restaurant into an abattoir. Mara crawled out from under the table on shaking hands, trying to process the carnage. 4 attackers dead, 2 more wounded and being secured by security teams. Antonio was down, blood spreading across his shoulder, but still conscious, still giving orders. 2 of the family bosses had taken hits, Martinelli clutching a leg wound, one of Calabrese's advisors not moving at all, and Russo was gone. "Where is he?" Lucian's voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp as a knife. "Where the hell is Russo?" One of the Moretti guards pointed toward a service exit, door still swinging. "Got out during the firefight, boss. Had his own security extract him." Lucian swore viciously in Italian, then seemed to remember Mara existed. His gaze found her still crouched by the table, dress torn and covered in someone else's blood, and something fractured in his expression. "Are you hurt?" He crossed to her in 3 strides, hands running over her arms and shoulders, checking for damage. "Mara, talk to me. Are you hit?" "I'm fine." Her voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "I'm not hurt. I'm fine." "You're in shock." Lucian pulled her to her feet, held her steady when her knees threatened to give out. "We need to leave. Now, before police arrive or Russo sends reinforcements." Don Benedetti was already organizing evacuation, barking orders about cleanup and witnesses, and making sure this incident disappeared before morning. The other families scattered quickly, professional enough to know that staying at an active crime scene was begging for federal attention. Nobody wanted. Lucian guided Mara toward the exit, Antonio following despite his injury, the remaining Moretti guards forming a protective circle. They made it to the vehicles without incident, but Mara could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over her like concrete, heavy and suffocating. She'd wanted to see Lucian's world, now she had, and it was exactly as terrifying as he'd warned. The drive back to the villa passed in shocked silence. Mara stared out the window and tried to forget the sound of bullets hitting flesh, the wet gurgling of someone drowning in their own blood, the casual way Russo had ordered Lucian's execution like he was requesting coffee. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Lucian didn't try to comfort her or explain or justify. He just sat beside her in grim silence, one hand gripping hers so tight it hurt, as if he could anchor her to reality through sheer force of will. At the villa, Carlotta had been alerted somehow and had medical supplies waiting. A doctor arrived within 20 minutes, clearly someone on the Moretti payroll who asked no questions and treated Antonio's shoulder wound with efficient competence. Mara watched it all from a distance, feeling disconnected from her own body, floating somewhere above the scene like a ghost observing the living. When the doctor left and Antonio had been settled in a guest room, Lucian finally turned to Mara. "I need to handle this," he said quietly. "Russo just declared war. I have to respond immediately or I look weak, but first I need to know you're all right." "Really all right, Mara. Not just physically." She looked at him, this man who'd just killed people with the same hands that were currently touching her face with devastating gentleness, and didn't know how to answer. Was she all right? Would she ever be all right again after watching the world explode into violence, after feeling the terror of a gun pointed at her head, after understanding viscerally that being Lucian's wife meant living with the constant possibility of death? I don't know, she admitted. Ask me tomorrow. Something painful crossed his face. This is what I was trying to protect you from. Why I wanted to keep you locked away where they couldn't reach you. Do you understand now, Clara? This is my world. Blood and bullets and enemies who'll use anyone you love as leverage. I understand. Mara stepped back from his touch, needing distance, needing space to think. But locking me away wouldn't have changed anything, Lucian. Russo still knew about me. He was using me as leverage tonight, despite all your careful secrets. Your fortress didn't work. Because I brought you out of it. Because I listened to you instead of trusting my instincts. Your instincts would have made me a prisoner forever. Anger finally cut through the shock, hot and clarifying. At least tonight I could see it coming. At least I wasn't trapped in ignorant captivity when they came for me. Your way, I'd have been helpless, defenseless, completely dependent on you for survival. You were still helpless tonight. Was I? Mara met his gaze squarely. Because I'm pretty sure I survived by staying calm and following instructions, by not panicking or making stupid moves that would have gotten us both killed. That's not helpless, Lucian. That's adapting, learning. Exactly what I told you I could do if you'd just give me the chance. He stared at her like she was speaking a language he didn't understand. This woman who'd just survived a firefight and was arguing about autonomy instead of begging to be locked away again. You're insane, he said finally. Completely insane. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just done being afraid. Mara moved toward the stairs, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. Handle your war, Lucian. Do whatever you need to do to Russo. But when you're finished, we're going to have a real conversation about what our marriage looks like going forward. Because I'm not going back in the cage. Not after tonight. Not ever. She made it to the bedroom before the shaking started again, full-body tremors that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with delayed reaction to almost dying. Mara stripped off the ruined dress, stood under scalding water for what might have been minutes or hours, trying to wash away the feeling of helplessness, the memory of that gun barrel swinging toward her face. When she finally emerged, wrung out and empty, Lucian was sitting on the bed waiting for her. I thought you had a war to start, Mara said, pulling on pajamas with numb fingers. I made calls, set things in motion, but I needed to see you first to make sure. He stopped, struggled with words that clearly didn't come easy. I thought I lost you tonight, when that gun pointed at you and I was on my knees, useless, unable to protect you. I've never been that terrified in my life, Mara. Not when my father died, not when Sophia, just never. She sat beside him, close but not touching, both of them staring at nothing. I was pretty terrified myself. But you didn't show it. You stayed calm, did exactly what you needed to do to survive. There was something like wonder in his voice. I've seen grown men with military training panic in situations like that, but you just handled it. Survival instinct. I've had practice being scared and functioning anyway. Mara leaned against him finally, too tired to maintain distance. My whole life before you was basically one long crisis. No money, no safety net, always one disaster away from complete collapse. You learn to stay calm when the world's falling apart because panicking doesn't pay bills or cure cancer or make loan sharks go away. Lucian's arm came around her shoulders, pulled her closer. I'm sorry you had to live like that. I'm not. She shifted to look at him. Because it made me strong enough to survive tonight. To survive you. Your world would have eaten me alive if I'd grown up soft and protected. But I didn't. I grew up learning that the only person who could save me was me. And that's still true, Lucian. Even married to you. Especially married to you. He was quiet for a long moment, processing that. Finally, what do you want from me, Mara? Really want if I could give you anything? She considered the question carefully, thinking about locked doors and beautiful prisons and the difference between safety and suffocation. I want partnership, real partnership, where you trust me enough to teach me how to protect myself instead of just protecting me. where I'm not a possession to guard, but a person you chose to build a life with, where we make decisions together instead of you dictating terms and expecting gratitude. That's asking me to fundamentally change who I am. No, it's asking you to remember who you were before Sophia died and your father got killed and you decided control was the only way to survive. Mara turned to face him fully. The man who courted me in Brooklyn, who read to my dying mother, who asked instead of demanded, that man understood partnership. He's still in there somewhere under all the armor and fear. I'm just asking you to find him again. What if I can't? What if 12 years of this life has made that impossible? Then we figure out what comes next, Mara said honestly. But you have to try, Lucian. Really try. Not just unlock a few doors and think that's enough. I'm talking about fundamental change in how you see me, see us, see this marriage. He studied her face in the dim light, searching for something she hoped he'd find. You're asking me to be vulnerable, to trust, to accept that I can't control every outcome. Yes, that's terrifying. I know, but staying the way you are is killing us both, just slower than a bullet. She took his hand, laced their fingers together. I'm not asking you to stop being careful, or to ignore real threats. I'm just asking you to treat me like an adult capable of understanding risk and making informed choices about my own life. Can you do that? The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they'd survived tonight and everything they still needed to navigate. Finally, Lucian squeezed her hand and nodded slowly. I'll try, he said. I won't promise I'll succeed. Won't promise I won't backslide into old patterns when I'm scared. But I'll try, Mara. For you. For us. For the possibility that maybe there's a version of this that doesn't end in tragedy. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. For now. They slept fitfully, both jolting awake at imagined sounds, hypervigilant even in the fortress that was supposed to keep them safe. At dawn, Lucian finally gave up on rest and disappeared into his office, already planning whatever response to Russo's attack would send the right message to the other families. Mara found him there hours later, surrounded by papers and screens, looking like he'd aged years overnight. Tell me what you're planning, she said from the doorway. He looked up, surprised. It's complicated, violent, not something I should worry about, not something I can handle. Mara crossed to the desk, sat down across from him. We just agreed on partnership, Lucian. That starts now. What are you planning for Russo? For a moment she thought he'd refuse, default back to protective secrets. But then something shifted in his expression and he turned one of the screens toward her. The Russo family operates primarily through port access. They control 3 major shipping terminals and use them to move everything from legitimate cargo to drugs and weapons. Take away their port access, we cripple their revenue and their influence. He pulled up satellite images of industrial waterfronts. I'm planning a coordinated strike, simultaneous hits on all 3 terminals. We'll destroy their infrastructure, intercept their current shipments, and make it clear that trying to kill me has consequences. People will die, Mara said quietly. Probably. Russo's guards, certainly. Maybe some of his family members if they're stupid enough to fight back. Lucian's voice was matter of fact, discussing murder like it was a business expense. But that's the point. When you come for a boss, when you try to execute him during council, there has to be overwhelming retaliation. Otherwise, everyone sees weakness and the whole structure collapses. Mara absorbed that, understanding the brutal logic even as it churned her stomach. When? Tonight. Fast response is crucial. Every hour I wait looks like hesitation. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. Lucian stood, shaking his head. This isn't a meeting, Mara. This is war. Active combat with people who'll shoot you on sight. You won't risk me, she interrupted. But I'm asking you to trust me enough to make that call myself. I need to see this, Lucian. All of it. The retaliation, the violence, the consequences of what happened last night. If I'm going to be part of your world, I need to understand what that means. Really understand, not just theoretically. You already saw enough last night. I saw defense, survival. This is different. This is offense. This is you being the monster people fear. She held his gaze steadily. I need to see that monster and decide if I can live with him, can love him, can build a life alongside him despite knowing exactly what he's capable of. Lucian stared at her for a long moment, clearly warring with every instinct telling him to refuse, to protect, to keep her safely distant from the darkest parts of himself. "If you come," he said finally, "you stay in the vehicle. Protected. You watch, but you don't participate. And if I tell you to run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. Agreed?" "Agreed. And afterward, when you've seen what I'm capable of, when you know exactly what kind of man you married," his voice cracked slightly, "if you want to leave, I won't stop you. I'll give you money, protection, a new identity if necessary, but I won't cage you again. Not after this." It was the most honest he'd ever been with her, this admission that his worst fear was showing her his true face and watching her recoil, that losing her to truth might be the one thing his control couldn't prevent. "I'm not leaving," Mara said softly. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But I need to make that choice with full information, Lucian, and so do you. You need to know if I can actually handle this life, or if you married someone fundamentally incompatible with who you have to be." He nodded slowly, accepting terms he clearly hated but understood the necessity of. "Tonight, then. Midnight. Wear dark clothes and comfortable shoes. And Mara? Yes? I love you. Whatever happens, whatever you see tonight, I need you to know that. I love you in ways I don't have words for, in ways that terrify me. And if watching me destroy Russo makes you hate me, I'll deserve it, but I'll still love you anyway." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable and more honest than anything he'd said before. Mara crossed to him, cupped his face in her hands, made him look at her. "I don't hate you," she whispered. "I'm angry at you, frustrated with you, terrified of what you represent. But I don't hate you, Lucian, and maybe that should scare me more than anything else." She kissed him then, tasting desperation and fear, and the complicated mess of emotions that passed for love between two broken people trying to build something from the wreckage of their separate traumas. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun was high and bright outside the window, indifferent to the darkness they were planning for nightfall. Mara spent the rest of the day in strange limbo, preparing for something she couldn't quite define. She found Antonio recovered enough to walk, shoulder bandaged but functional, already coordinating with Lucian's team about tonight's operation. He looked at her with new respect when she told him she'd be coming along, as if surviving last night had earned her some kind of credibility in his eyes. "You did good," he said simply. "Not many civilians keep their heads like that under fire. The boss chose well." It was probably the highest compliment she'd get from Lucian's security chief, and Mara accepted it with a nod, filing it away with all the other surreal aspects of her new reality. As midnight approached, she dressed as instructed: black jeans, dark sweater, running shoes that would let her move fast if necessary. She looked like she was preparing for a robbery, which she supposed wasn't that far from the truth. The woman staring back from the mirror was almost unrecognizable from the desperate waitress who'd accepted Lucian's proposal 3 months ago. That woman had been looking for salvation. This woman was walking into damnation with her eyes open, choosing it deliberately, and still wasn't entirely sure if that made her brave or insane. The convoy that assembled in the villa's courtyard was larger than before. 3 SUVs packed with armed men, serious and silent, preparing for war. Lucian emerged from the house looking like death in expensive tailoring, and when he saw Mara waiting, something complicated crossed his face. "Last chance to stay behind," he said quietly. "Not taking it." "Then stay close. Listen to Antonio, and remember, what you're about to see is what I have to be to survive in this world. Not what I want to be, not with you, never with you." Mara nodded, understanding that he was trying to separate himself from the violence, trying to preserve some part of their relationship that wasn't contaminated by what he did in the dark. But she knew better. Knew that you couldn't compartmentalize that cleanly. That the man who destroyed Russo's empire would be the same man who came home to her afterward. And she'd have to decide if she could love them both or neither. They climbed into the lead vehicle and drove into the darkness toward whatever came next. The port terminal sprawled before them like a sleeping giant, all concrete and steel, and the skeletal silhouettes of cranes reaching toward a moonless sky. Shipping containers were stacked in geometric patterns that suggested order and legitimate business, but Mara could see the guards patrolling between them, weapons carried with casual familiarity that spoke to violence as routine. Lucien's convoy stopped half a mile out, engines cutting to silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Through the tinted windows, Mara watched his men distribute weapons and check equipment with the efficient choreography of people who'd done this many times before. No one looked nervous. No one questioned the orders. They were soldiers following their general into battle, and the outcome was apparently never in doubt. "You stay here," Lucien said, checking his own weapon with practiced ease. "Antonio remains with you. The vehicle is armored, bulletproof glass. If shooting starts, you get down, and you don't move until I come back for you. Understood?" "Understood." Mara's voice was steadier than she felt. "Be careful." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw everything he couldn't say written in his expression: apology and determination and the desperate hope that she'd still be here when this was over. Then he leaned in, kissed her with bruising intensity, and was gone. Antonio settled into the driver's seat, eyes on the mirrors, one hand resting on his own weapon. "He'll be fine," he said quietly. "I've seen him do this dozens of times. He always comes back." "How many people has he killed?" Mara heard herself ask. "In 12 years, how many?" Antonio was quiet for a moment, considering whether to answer. Enough that he stopped counting, not enough that it keeps him awake at night. "There's a difference between murder and warfare, Mrs. Moretti. Your husband understands that distinction better than most." Mara wasn't sure the distinction mattered to the dead, but she kept that thought to herself and focused on the terminal where Lucien's team was moving into position. She could see them spreading out, surrounding the facility from multiple angles, cutting off escape routes with military precision. Whatever was about to happen had been planned down to the second, coordinated chaos that would look random to anyone who didn't know better. The first explosion lit the night like daylight, a percussion wave that rocked their vehicle even at this distance. Flames erupted from what looked like a fuel depot, painting the sky orange and sending guards running toward the disaster. In the confusion, Lucien's men struck. Mara couldn't see details from this distance, but she could hear the gunfire, could see muzzle flashes and figures dropping, and the systematic destruction of everything Russo had built at this terminal. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, but felt eternal. Violence compressed into brutal efficiency, overwhelming force designed to send a message that would echo through the underworld for years. When silence finally fell, broken only by the crackle of fires and distant sirens approaching, Lucien emerged from the smoke like something conjured from nightmares. His suit was torn, face smudged with soot, but he was walking under his own power and his eyes when they found Mara. Through the windshield were alive with something fierce and terrible. He climbed into the vehicle and the convoy pulled out immediately, leaving destruction in their wake. No one spoke. The air itself seemed heavy with what they'd just done. With the lives ended and the empire wounded and the brutal mathematics of retaliation. "How many?" Mara asked finally, unable to bear the silence. 7 dead on their side, 3 wounded. We took no casualties." Lucien's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone reciting statistics rather than body counts. "The terminal's destroyed. Their current shipments are seized. Conservative estimate puts Russo's losses at 40 million euros, not counting the strategic disadvantage of losing port access." "And the other 2 terminals?" "Similar results. My teams are en route back now." He looked at her, and she saw the question lurking behind his carefully blank expression, saw him waiting for her verdict, for judgment, for the moment she'd finally recoil from the monster she'd married. "Russo will retaliate," Mara said instead. "This isn't over." Something flickered across Lucien's face, surprise maybe, that she was thinking strategically rather than morally. "He'll try, but he's wounded now, weak. The other families will see that. Some will move to support him out of fear of setting precedent. Others will see opportunity in his vulnerability. Either way, we've shifted the power dynamics. Made it clear that coming for me has consequences that outweigh any potential gain. So more violence, more death, until someone wins or everyone's too exhausted to keep fighting. Welcome to my world, Clara." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "This is what I tried to protect you from, what I didn't want you to see. Are you satisfied now? Do you finally understand why the cage was kindness?" Mara turned to face him fully, studying this man covered in soot and someone else's blood, vibrating with post-combat adrenaline and the desperate need for her to tell him he wasn't a monster, that what he'd just done was justified, that she could still love him despite knowing exactly what he was capable of. "I understand that you're very good at violence," she said carefully, "that you've built an empire on fear and strategic brutality, that you can destroy people without hesitation when they threaten what's yours." She paused, making sure he was listening. "But I also understand that you didn't enjoy it, that you do this because in your mind it's necessary, not because you're sadistic or cruel. There's still a difference, Lucian. Small, maybe, but real." "Does the difference matter to the men who died tonight?" "No, but it matters to me. And it should matter to you." Mara reached for his hand, surprised when he let her take it. "You asked me what I want from you, what I need from this marriage. I think I finally know." He waited, bracing himself like a man expecting a blow. "I need honesty," Mara continued. "Complete honesty about who you are and what you do. No more pretty lies or careful omissions. No more trying to protect me from reality by keeping me ignorant. If I'm going to be your wife, truly your wife, I need to know everything. The violence, the fear, the impossible choices you make to keep your empire running. All of it. You'll hate me. Maybe, but I'll hate you honestly instead of loving a version of you that doesn't exist." She squeezed his hand. "And in exchange, you give me freedom, real freedom, not locked doors disguised as protection, not guards watching my every move. You trust me enough to let me make my own choices about risk, about safety, about what kind of life I want to build alongside yours." Lucian stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language, trying to parse meaning from impossible words. "You're asking me to show you my worst self and then trust you to stay anyway. That's insane, Mara. Fundamentally insane." "Probably, but it's the only version of this marriage I can survive." She meant it too, with a clarity that surprised her. "I can live with you being a crime lord. I can live with the violence and the moral compromises and the constant low-level terror. What I can't live with is being treated like a child who needs protection from the truth, like a possession instead of a partner. That's the cage I won't accept, Lucian, not the danger, the condescension." The vehicle fell silent except for the sound of tires on asphalt, carrying them back toward the villa through darkness that felt less ominous than it had hours ago. Lucian didn't respond immediately, just sat there processing what she'd said, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. Finally, he spoke, voice rough with something that sounded almost like hope. "If I do this, if I give you complete honesty and real freedom, you have to promise me something in return." "What?" "You don't leave without telling me why. You don't just disappear one day because the weight of knowing who I am becomes too heavy to bear." His eyes met hers, and she saw genuine fear there, the vulnerability of someone offering his throat to teeth that could tear it out. "If you decide you can't do this, can't love me despite everything you know, you tell me to my face. You give me a chance to change your mind, or at least to say goodbye. That's all I ask." It was such a small request for such a large concession, and Mara felt something shift in her chest, some complicated tangle of emotions that might eventually approximate love if they both survived long enough to let it grow. "I promise," she said. "No disappearing. If I leave, you'll know why." "Then we have a deal." Lucian raised their joined hands, pressed a kiss to her knuckles that felt almost reverent. "God help us both, Mara. I have no idea if this is going to work." "Me neither, but at least we'll fail honestly." He laughed at that, sharp and surprised, some of the terrible tension finally draining from his shoulders. "You're the strangest woman I've ever met. Possibly the bravest. Definitely the most inconvenient. You married me." "Worst decision of my life," he said, but his tone said otherwise, said that maybe, impossibly, this was actually the best decision either of them had made, even if they were still figuring out how to make it work. They arrived back at the villa as dawn threatened the horizon, the same golden light that had witnessed their confrontation after the warehouse visit now returning to find them changed, transformed by violence and honesty into something that might eventually resemble a functional partnership. Carlotta met them at the door with her usual discretion, not even blinking at Lucian's disheveled state or the smell of smoke that clung to both of them. She simply indicated that breakfast would be ready whenever they wanted it, then disappeared to give them privacy. Mara headed for the shower, desperate to wash away the night's residue, but Lucian caught her hand before she could escape. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not running, for staying despite seeing exactly what I'm capable of, for being strong enough to demand truth instead of comfortable lies." "Don't thank me yet. We still have to figure out how this actually works day to day." Mara squeezed his hand, then released it. "And you still have a war to finish. Russo isn't going to accept defeat gracefully. No, he'll regroup, call in favors, try to rebuild what we destroyed. But he's weakened now, vulnerable. The other families will be watching to see if he can recover or if the Moretti attack was the beginning of his decline." "What happens if he can't recover?" Lucian's expression went distant, calculating. "Then his territory gets absorbed by whoever's strong enough to take it. His family loses influence, and the balance of power in the region shifts in my favor." He paused. "Or he does something desperate and stupid, and we end up in a protracted war that bleeds us both dry until someone from outside our region sees opportunity and moves in to take advantage of the chaos." "So you need him weak, but not destroyed. Contained, but not eliminated." "Exactly. Which is the part of this business that most people don't understand. It's not about wiping out your enemies. It's about maintaining equilibrium where everyone has just enough power to defend their interests, but not enough to destabilize the entire system." Mara absorbed that, understanding the brutal chess game Lucian played every day, the constant balancing act between strength and restraint. "And if he comes after me again? Uses me as leverage like he tried last night? Then I'll kill him." No hesitation, no equivocation, just flat certainty that turned the words into prophecy. "And I'll make sure everyone in our world understands that touching you means death. Not strategic violence or measured retaliation, just death." She should have been horrified by the casual way he promised murder. Instead, Mara felt something warm and complicated unfurl in her chest, understanding that this was Lucian's version of love. Absolute, possessive, willing to burn the world down to keep her safe. It wasn't healthy or balanced or anything a therapist would recommend, but it was real. And after everything they'd survived together, real mattered more than perfect. "Try not to start any unnecessary wars on my behalf," she said dryly. "I'd feel terrible if people died just because someone looked at me wrong. I make no promises." But there was warmth in his voice now, the terrible tension of the past few days finally easing into something that might eventually resemble normalcy. "Go shower, Mara. Sleep if you can. I have calls to make and damage to assess, but I'll be up in a few hours." She left him in his office surrounded by screens and phones and the machinery of empire and went upstairs to wash away the night. Under scalding water, she tried to process everything that had happened, everything she'd learned about herself and Lucian and the impossible relationship they were attempting to navigate. 3 months ago, she'd been nobody. A waitress drowning in debt and grief, invisible to everyone except the predators who saw weakness and opportunity. Now she was Mara Moretti, wife to one of the most powerful crime lords in southern Italy, complicit in violence she could never have imagined, choosing to stay with a man who killed people and called it business. She should have felt guilty, should have been planning escape routes and contacting authorities and doing whatever moral people did when they discovered they'd married a monster. Instead, she felt oddly calm, centered, like some fundamental question about who she was and what she was capable of had finally been answered. She could survive this, could navigate Lucian's world without losing herself entirely, could demand partnership and honesty and real freedom while understanding that some cages weren't made of locks but of love and fear and the complicated math of survival. When she emerged from the shower, wrapped in a robe and exhausted down to her bones, she found Lucian asleep on top of the covers, still wearing his ruined suit, phone clutched in one hand like he'd passed out mid-conversation. He looked younger in sleep, vulnerable, the monster stripped away to reveal just a man who was very, very tired. Mara carefully extracted the phone from his grip, set it on the nightstand, then climbed into bed beside him. He stirred, reaching for her automatically even in sleep, and she let him pull her close, let herself be held by hands that had killed people hours ago and were now cradling her with devastating gentleness. "I love you," she whispered, testing the words, seeing if they felt true or if she was just fooling herself into accepting the unacceptable. They felt complicated, messy, nothing like the fairy tale romance she'd imagined as a girl. but they felt real. And right now that was enough. They slept through most of the day, both exhausted by violence and honesty and the emotional warfare of the past 72 hours. When Mara finally woke, late afternoon sun was streaming through windows she noticed were no longer locked. Terrace doors standing open to Mediterranean breeze and the sound of gulls crying over distant waves. Lucian was gone, but had left a note on his pillow in bold, slashing handwriting. Meeting with the families. Negotiating terms for peace with Russo. Back by evening. The villa is yours. Go anywhere, do anything. You're free. L. Mara read it 3 times, testing for catches or conditions or hidden meanings, but the message was clear. He'd kept his promise. No more locks, no more guards watching her every move. Just freedom, offered without strings or expectations. She got dressed and wandered through the villa, exploring rooms she'd only glimpsed before. Found Lucian's private library full of books in multiple languages, a music room with a grand piano that looked well used, a terrace overlooking the cliffs where you could watch the sunset over water that stretched to infinity. Each space revealed something new about the man she'd married. His love of classical literature, his apparently skilled piano playing, his appreciation for beauty that existed separate from the violence of his business. He was more than the monster, more than the cold, efficient killer who destroyed Russo's terminals without hesitation. He was complicated, contradictory, capable of both devastating brutality and surprising tenderness. And Mara was starting to understand that loving him meant accepting all of it, the darkness and the light, the violence and the vulnerability, the impossible complexity of a man shaped by trauma into something that defied easy categorization. She was standing on the terrace watching the sunset when she heard vehicles approaching, Lucian returning presumably with news about whatever negotiations had occurred. Mara stayed where she was, letting him find her instead of rushing to meet him, claiming her own space and time in a small act of independence that felt important. He appeared a few minutes later, looking tired but satisfied, jacket discarded and tie loosened, carrying 2 glasses of wine like peace offerings. How did it go? Mara accepted the wine, sipped it, tasted something expensive and Italian and probably older than she was. Better than expected. Russo agreed to a truce with terms favorable to us. He keeps his remaining territory, but acknowledges Moretti's supremacy in the region. He pays reparations for the attack during council, and publicly apologizes to the other families for disrupting the peace. Lucian leaned against the terrace railing, looking out at the darkening sea. He also agreed to never come near you again, on penalty of immediate and total war. So you won. We survived. In this business, that's the same thing as winning. He turned to face her. The other families were impressed, apparently, that I could respond so decisively while also knowing when to accept peace instead of pushing for total destruction. Several of them made overtures about strengthening alliances, expanding cooperation on various enterprises. Tonight's violence increased our influence rather than diminishing it. Crime pays, Mara said dryly. In this case, yes. He moved closer, and she could see uncertainty in his eyes, the question he was afraid to ask. You explored the villa, tested your freedom. Did you find what you were looking for? I found a library I want to spend time in, a piano I'd like to hear you play, a dozen rooms that suggest you're more than just a crime lord with control issues. Mara set down her wine glass, stepped into his space. I found glimpses of the man I married underneath all the armor. That's something. Is it enough? She considered the question honestly, thinking about everything she'd witnessed and survived and learned in the past few days. The violence and fear, yes, but also the vulnerability and genuine love and the possibility that they could build something real if they both committed to the work. Ask me again in a year, Mara said finally. Right now, it's enough that I'm choosing to stay, that I'm not locked in or coerced or trapped by circumstances. I'm here because I want to be, because I think we might actually have a chance if we're honest with each other. And you keep your word about freedom and partnership. I will. Lucian pulled her into his arms, held her with an intensity that suggested he still couldn't quite believe she was real, was staying, was choosing him despite knowing exactly what he was. I'll fail sometimes. I'll backslide into old patterns when I'm scared. But I'll try, Mara. Every day I'll try to be the man you need instead of the monster I've become. You're both, she said against his chest, And I'm choosing to love both, even when it's hard, even when it scares me, because the alternative is running, and I'm done running. They stood there as darkness fell completely, wrapped around each other on a terrace overlooking the sea, two broken people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances and were trying to build something that resembled a life. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe. It would require constant work and honesty, and the willingness to navigate moral gray areas that most people never had to consider. But it was theirs, chosen freely, with full knowledge of the costs and complications, and maybe that was enough. "Play something for me," Mara said eventually, pulling back to look at him. "On the piano. Something that has nothing to do with crime or violence or your empire. Just music." Lucian looked surprised, then pleased, then almost shy, an expression she'd never seen on him before. "It's been months since I played. I might be rusty." "I don't care about perfection. I just want to see this part of you, the part that exists separate from everything else." He led her to the music room where the grand piano waited in the gathering darkness. Lucian sat at the bench and Mara settled beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, far enough to watch his hands on the keys. When he began to play, the music that filled the room was achingly beautiful, something classical she didn't recognize, all cascading notes and complicated harmonies that spoke of someone who'd spent years mastering this instrument. His eyes closed, his expression softened, and for a few minutes Lucian wasn't a crime lord or a killer or a man shaped by violence into something dangerous. He was just a person who understood beauty and could create it with his hands, who'd found in music what Mara had found in her mother's bedside during those final days, a kind of peace that existed separate from the brutality of their circumstances. When the piece finally ended, silence rushed back in like a held breath being released. Lucian opened his eyes and looked at her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him before. "My mother taught me," he said quietly, "before she died when I was 12. She wanted me to have something that was mine, that had nothing to do with the family business or my father's expectations, something clean." "It's beautiful," Mara whispered. "You're beautiful when you play." He kissed her then, soft and searching, tasting of wine and hope, and the fragile possibility that maybe they could find moments of grace between the violence. That maybe love could exist in the spaces between fear and control, honesty and acceptance, the monster and the man who is trying desperately to be something more. They made love on the piano bench with a recklessness that would have been impossible days ago, when everything between them was locked doors and desperate negotiations. Now there was freedom in the way they touched each other, a kind of honesty that came from knowing the worst and choosing each other anyway. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the floor beside the piano, wrapped in discarded clothes, and the knowledge that they'd crossed some threshold together moved from performance into something that might eventually become real partnership. "I meant what I said," Lucian murmured against her hair. "About trying, about being different. I don't know if I can be the man you deserve, but I'll spend the rest of my life attempting it." "You're already the man I chose," Mara said. "Flawed and dangerous and surprisingly good at piano. That's enough. We'll figure out the rest as we go." They stayed there until moonlight replaced sunset, talking quietly about nothing and everything. Her mother's favorite books, his sister's laugh, the small human details that existed beneath the dramatic violence of their circumstances, building the foundation of real intimacy that might eventually support the weight of all the impossible things they'd have to navigate together. Eventually, they made their way upstairs to the bedroom where this had all begun, where Mara had realized she'd married a beautiful cage and decided to either escape or transform it into something livable. The doors stood open to night air, no longer locked, and she could walk out onto the terrace and look at stars that didn't judge the choices she'd made. "Thank you," Lucian said from the doorway, watching her stand in the moonlight, "for staying, for demanding better from me, for being strong enough to love me despite knowing what I am." "Thank you for letting me," Mara replied, "for trusting me with the truth, for giving me freedom instead of just pretty lies disguised as protection." "Always," he promised. "From now on, always honesty. Always freedom. Even when it terrifies me." "Especially when it terrifies you," she corrected, turning to face him. "That's when trust matters most." He crossed to her, pulled her into his arms, and they stood there on the terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, Two people who'd found each other in darkness and were trying to build something that could survive in the light. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more violence, more fear, more impossible choices as they navigated the criminal underworld that Lucian couldn't escape and Mara had chosen to enter. There would be moments when his control instincts overwhelmed his promises, when her demands for freedom collided with his terror of losing her, when they'd have to decide again whether this impossible relationship was worth the constant work. But for tonight, under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas and would outlast them all, they had each other. They had honesty. They had the fragile, complicated beginnings of something that might eventually become love if they were both brave enough to let it grow. The gilded cage had been transformed, not destroyed because some dangers were real and would always require vigilance, but expanded, made livable, turned into something that resembled partnership instead of imprisonment. Mara Cole had walked into Lucian Moretti's life looking for salvation and found something infinitely more complicated. She'd married a monster and discovered a man underneath. She'd demanded freedom and been given the truth instead, which was perhaps the greater gift. And as dawn approached once again, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility, she knew she'd made the right choice. Not the safe choice, or the easy one, or the choice anyone else would recommend, but hers, freely chosen, with full knowledge of the costs. And that made all the difference.